football drafts coming up in the next week or two, and the season starting very shortly as well. But he has a few wide receivers that I think are going to be busts this season. The first guy is Odell Beckham Jr. of the Cleveland Browns. So I mentioned earlier that he was a wide receiver I'm going to avoid, and I think he's going to be a bust as well this season, coming off another big injury, another big surgery, torn ACL last season. And Beckham, he had got off to a good start last year before he went down in week 4 of the season. 23 catches, 319 yards receiving, and 3 receiving touchdowns. And he also had 72 yards rushing and a rushing touchdown. So right here, he was looking good. He was looking healthy. But once again, he couldn't stay healthy. And obviously, he hasn't been productive over the last few years. In 2019, he wasn't productive. Last season, he got hurt. And this season here, they're projecting him 71 catches, 985 yards, and 7 touchdowns. So obviously, in my opinion, his best days are behind him, like he had with the New York Giants, where those first 3-4 seasons of his NFL career, he was breaking all type of records and putting up all types of fantasy points. But right now, in this Brown offense, and just with all the wear and tear and the injuries on his body, I don't see it happening, and I could see him being a bust this season. Right now, he's going anywhere from the 4th to the 6th round in fantasy drafts, and I'll let someone else deal with the headache with Odell Beckham. It just seems like each and every season, it's something with him. So right now, I don't think it's going to be a good season for him, and I think he won't be a guy that's very productive for fantasy teams week in and week out. The next wide receiver I think is going to be a bust this year is Robby Anderson of the Carolina Panthers. So Robby Anderson, he's been good now the last 2 seasons with the New York Jets a few seasons ago, and then last season in his first year with the Carolina Panthers. And I know the Panthers traded for one of his former quarterbacks from the New York Jets and Sam Darnold in the offseason. Like Robby Anderson last year, he had a great season, but I just don't think he's going to do it once again. And I think Sam Darnold and him could definitely be on the same page, but I don't know if he's going to crack the 1,000 yards again. So last season for Anderson, 95 catches, 1,096 receiving yards, only 3 receiving touchdowns, and a 2-point conversion and a fumble loss. So right here, I know Curtis Samuel left town. He went somewhere else, but we got David Moore over there for this team, who was a good receiver for a few seasons over there in Seattle, so he'll be in the mix as well. And Robby, I just don't see him putting up big numbers, and he's a guy I can't really trust drafting him in the 4th to the 6th round range as well, when last season he was basically a late round filler or a guy you picked up off the waiver wire. So I know he did good last year, but I don't see it happening this year. And the projections are 1,035 yards and 6 touchdowns, so they're projecting him to have more fantasy points than he did last season. I'll tell you this, week 1 versus the Jets, I think he has a big game and catches a couple deep balls versus former team. Him and Sam Darnold going to try to show the Jets up, but after that, I think it'll just be a basic season for Anderson and nothing crazy. I think he'll have probably 750 to 800 yards is my projections for him. I don't think he'll crack the 1,000 yards this season, and I think he's going to be a wide receiver that's going to be a bust. The next wide receiver I think is going to be a bust this season is JuJu SmithSchuster of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So last season, he definitely was a bust, is JuJu. Last year, 97 catches, 831 receiving yards, and 9 touchdowns. So obviously, he picked it up towards the end of the season, but he still didn't put up the huge numbers like we expected to him. Last season, he was a 2nd, 3rd round pick and latest in fantasy drafts, and he put up mediocre numbers for fantasy owners. This year, he's going anywhere from the 7th to the 8th round drafted in fantasy leagues. But this season, I see the Steelers using more Deontay Johnson, using Chase Claypool more as well, who had a monster rookie season, and obviously the rookie Najee Harris at running back. I think he's going to be a monster, like everyone expecting him to be, being a 2nd rounder in fantasy leagues this year. So JuJu, he's a guy last season that was inconsistent, and I know he picked things up towards the end of the season, but a lot of single-digit games he had, and I could see more of that again this season in fantasy football. So if someone else wants to take a shot at him, they could go ahead, but I think he's going to be a bust, and if he breaks out, he breaks out, but I just think he's not going to do it with all the weapons over there in Pittsburgh, and already we've seen him decline a little over the last couple seasons since Antonio Brown left. The next wide receiver is Jeudy of the Denver Broncos. So Jeudy, a mixed bag of results last season was for him in his first year in Denver. And now Teddy Bridgewater comes over as the quarterback here. And Jeudy last season, 52 catches, 856 yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns on 113 targets. The projections this season for him, 1,075 yards and 7 touchdowns. So I think that'll be a pretty good season if he does put it up here as Jeudy. But Cortland Sutton's coming back into the mix. They got a couple other young guys over there. And I think they're going to use a lot of running game, to be honest with you, is this Denver Bronco team. They still got a pretty decent defense that could keep them in ball games. And Teddy Bridgewater, he's more of a game manager and an underneath thrower. I know last season they opened up the playbook a little over there in Carolina for him, but this season I don't see it happening over here in Denver. I'm going to see a lot of Melvin Gordon and Javonte Williams, in my opinion, getting work. So Jeudy, I still think he'll be a decent bench receiver for fantasy owners. But I think he's going to be a bust because he's another wide receiver going anywhere from the 7th to the 8th round in most fantasy drafts as well. And I don't think he's going to put up that production where you get a receiver in that round who's going to be an every week flex option or a third wide receiver, depending what type of positions you play in your fantasy league. So Jerry Jeudy, I still think he could be decent, but I think he's going to be a bust considering his ADP and the projections for him this season. And the 5th and final wide receiver, I think that's going to be a bust this season's Kenny Golladay of the New York Giants. And Kenny Golladay was a wide receiver I said to avoid going into fantasy drafts. And already what I'm saying is coming true. He's injured once again this season. Now it's a hamstring injury. We don't know how serious it is, but right off the bat here, with a few weeks before the season, it's not a good sign in my opinion, even though he probably most likely will play week 1 versus the Denver Broncos is Kenny Golladay. This season, he don't have the gunslinger like Matthew Stafford. He's in a new system. He's got Daniel Jones as his quarterback, who obviously is no Matt Stafford, in my opinion here. And I just think we're going to see a lot of inconsistency, even if Galladay's healthy this season. We're not going to see some monster games each and every week. We're going to see some games where he only has a few catches and makes a few plays. And if Saquon Barkley becomes 100%, he's going to get a lot of work, obviously, in the backfield. And he's going to steal a lot of receptions from these giant receivers. So I think Kenny Golladay is going to be a bust this season. And I'll let someone else deal with him anywhere from the 5th to the 6th round, where he's been going in fantasy drafts here. Last season for Golladay, in a shortened year for him because of the injuries. Only 20 catches, 338 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns on 32 targets. And now this season they're projecting 64 grabs, 1,064 yards and 6 touchdowns. That'll be a pretty decent season for him. But already coming into training camp with the injury and with him getting a downgrade at quarterback, I don't think Kenny Golladay has a good season, and I think he's going to be a bust. So that's a few wide receivers that I think will be busts here going into fantasy football and the NFL season in the upcoming weeks.